Okay, folks, before you start your end of the Cold War assignment, I wanted to just give you a little recap since we haven't touched on the Cold War really since the end of marking period 4 when we went out on our hiatus here. So I'm just going to review the big topics. You don't need to take any notes here. You have all these notes. I just want to review, kind of get everybody kind of their mind back on what was going on with it. So the Cold War um, was a conflict between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and their allies at the end of World War II. So, although they were allies in World War II, after the war, you have this growing climate of mistrust and different philosophies led to the Cold War. A continuing state of hostility and tension between the two superpowers continues, and it becomes known as the Cold War because the armed battles never occur between the two big players. Um, the roots of this is the West feared the spread of communism. Stalin had basically forced communist countries in Poland and Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. These countries were known as satellites. And then Stalin began to put pressure on Greece, Greece and Turkey, so the United States acted. Um, Eastern Europe after the war was occupied by the Soviet Union, and the communist governments were installed in the following states there. You can see these all here on the map. There's East Germany, there's Poland, here's Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria down here. They were often called the satellite states, and if you can remember from the regions in January, the reference to the Iron Curtain supposedly dropped over Europe, and it's separating the East and the West. Okay, and here's a little wider view of it. The green are the U.S. allies, the NATO members. The kind of orangey color there is the Warsaw Pact. That's the Soviet Union and their allies. You have Yugoslavia is also a communist country, and then you see Austria, Switzerland, Finland, and Stockholm, Sweden, all being neutral countries in Europe at the time. Cold War's genesis is in Europe, but it will spread around the planet, as we'll see in a moment. Okay. The U.S. response to the Soviet aggression, I guess, for lack of a better term, is what's called the Truman Doctrine, and it comes out of a speech that the President Truman gave in 1947. Economic and military program designed to help other nations resist Soviet aggression, based on this idea of containment, which involved limiting communism to areas currently already under Soviet control. We sent military aid to Greece and Turkey and to elsewhere around the planet, as we're going to see. The Marshall Plan came out of this, and it's kind of a rebuild Europe plan. Europe is devastated after the war. There's a massive economic aid package to strengthen the war damaged countries of Europe. We offered it to everybody, including the Soviet Union. Stalin forbid any of the states under his control to accept any of this aid. Germany rebuilt faster. They called it the German miracle. It was led by this man here, Konrad Adenauer, who's the first chancellor after Hitler. Germany quickly becomes an economic power. Great Britain really begins to adopt the welfare state that we see in a lot of countries of Europe and elsewhere. Government took over a lot of industries, education, healthcare. They didn't continue the industries. They eventually reprivatized the industries, but it was really a program of socialism after the war. France economic recovery was slower. They had a lot of political problems developing. Eventually, Charles de Gaulle, the man in the military uniform there, who had been the leader of the Free French during World War II, becomes president in 1958 and kind of brings some stability to France. In Germany, there's a crisis in the immediate aftermath of the war. As you remember, Germany was divided into 4 zones. The U.S., Great Britain, France, and Soviet Union all had occupied zones. This was set up at the the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. Stalin was really fearful of a united, strong Germany, so he set up a separate country in East Germany with a communist government. Um, West Germany, protected by the other three allies, became democratic. The capital city of Berlin was also split into four parts, as we'll see in the maps here. Okay, so you've got there's Germany. Here's the east, and then the other three zones will eventually become West Germany, and then you have East Berlin, and the three zones will eventually become the city of West Berlin. Okay, and West Berlin will always be a thorn in the side of the Soviets all the way up till the end of the Cold War, as you're going to see. Um, 1948, Stalin tried to force the Allies out of Berlin by cutting off all the land routes of supplies. President Truman ordered supplies flown in to Berlin. It was successful because Stalin didn't try to shoot down the flights. Eventually, in 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to act as a physical symbolism of communism that cut East Berlin off from West Berlin. Um, the Berlin airlift causes the creation of alliances. NATO, made up of West Germany and the Western powers, sponsored by the U.S. The Warsaw Pact, made up of the Soviet Union and its satellites, both vow to protect their members if any is attacked. Okay, just some kind of things that go on here in Europe. So in 1952, this is the beginning of kind of the organization of Europe and the coming together, at least economically, of Europe. They create what's called the European Coal and Steel Community is formed. It includes France, Belgium, West Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and Luxembourg. It was formed to cooperate in the production of coal and steel. All the countries would benefit from economic prosperity. There would be no tariffs between them. They'd have fair prices and the beginning of economic interdependence. That grows into the European Economic Community, where members agreed to drop all trade barriers and tariffs. They agreed to charge a common tariff on all non-member nations. They also agreed to protect the primary industries of each nation. Today it's called the EU. They share a central bank, central currency. They coordinate their foreign policy and joint action on social issues, immigration, and health. Now, Cold War climate. You guys didn't grow up in this, so it's probably really foreign to you. But as somebody who grew up in it, it was really pretty much in your face almost every day, just kind of like COVID-19 is right now. You just can't, it's there all the time. Iron Curtain. Though Stalin dies in 1953, the Cold War continues. The Soviet Union crushes a series of revolts, first in Hungary and then later in Czechoslovakia. And it's really a climate of repression. The East becomes known as the Iron Curtain. You have the arms race where they're competing for first over the atomic bomb and then over who can build more weapons and bigger weapons and the most powerful weapons during this. And that folds into space, where you have a competition over first who's going to put the first satellite up, and then who's going to put the first man up, and then who's going to get to the moon. And it culminates with the Star Wars program. It was an attempt to put space-based weapons, which I'll get into in the end of the Cold War document. Okay. After Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev comes to power. He moves a lot away from what they call de-Stalinization. They try to un-Stalin the United States, the Soviet Union. Talks about peaceful coexistence, signs a nuclear test ban treaty, but the Cold War continues because under Khrushchev, the Soviets developed their nuclear power program. They launched Sputnik, the first satellite. They send the first man to space, and then the big one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I'll get into a minute from now. There's a very famous picture of Khrushchev giving a speech at the United Nations where he takes off his shoe, and to make his point, he begins pounding on the lectern with his shoe. He is followed by Leonid Brezhnev, who begins a policy of détente in the 70s. It was trying to kind of thaw relations. There's several treaties signed in this to protect, not only to maybe start limiting nuclear arms, but also to start protecting human rights during this time period. Okay, it ends this détente program with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which the document will get into a little bit more. The kind of the backdrop of this whole thing is that it happened. The invasion happened shortly before the 1980 Olympics, and You have this famous The Miracle on Ice, the movie Miracle, which is kind of the symbol of the underdog American college kids defeating an almost professional level Soviet system. Eventually, Brezhnev dies. He's succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who dies, has cancer and dies, and then Konstantin Chernenko, who's very old and he only lasts a while, and then a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, comes in. Some of the weapons of the Cold War: propaganda, alliances, the scientific competition, and a lot of economic competition. And that's really what eventually designs it, is the economic might of the United States wins this Cold War because the Soviets just cannot keep up any longer. Um, you got espionage, the CIA and the KGB. You have attempting to overthrow governments. Cuba was a Soviet overthrow. Chile and Iran were American overthrows of potentially communist leading countries. So everybody was doing it. Some of the big confrontations: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Cuba, the Middle East. It was a constant battleground, and Africa and Latin America became really a background in all this. Okay, and we went over all that in class. If you want to pause the video and just kind of review those to help your memory, that's fine. Um, just a little bit on the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets attempted to place ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons in Cuba, their ally. As you can see from the map, Cuba is very close to the United States, and the concern is that these would be first strike weapons that would be able to get to the United States before we could stop them. So it was a really big thing. There's a whole 13-day standoff, and eventually the Soviets decide not to run the U.S. blockade and pull the missiles out of Cuba. The UN comes to prominence during this. It's a reboot kind of the League of Nations that failed after World War I. The original idea was developed by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1940, which laying out the war aims. Roosevelt always referred to the Allies as the United Nations, and that really becomes the forerunner of it. The main purpose there is maintain peace and security, promote equal rights, self-determination, international competition, and promote human rights. 45 to 51, nations signed the charter, approved the charter. It becomes permanently located in New York City. There you have some major parts: the General Assembly, where all nations determine policy. There is a Security Council of 15 nations with the permanent members, as you see there, and 10 rotating members. It's really an attempt to maintain peace, and it's been reasonably successful. We haven't had a huge war. We still have had war, but not anything on the scale of the world wars. Some various economic and social organizations: the World Bank, the Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, very active right now, the International Monetary Fund, as you see in the picture. And then the world kind of divides into three groups. Okay, you have the U.S. and our allies, the USSR and their allies, and then what are called the third world nations, these non-aligned nations. You did an assignment on the non-alignment movement a couple weeks ago, so that should keep that in mind. The UN had many different actions. You can see the whole list here of UN involvement. They've been involved in other places also. In Africa with peacekeeping and a lot of other things like that. So now that should kind of give you the recap of the Cold War. So now you're going to go into the Google Doc on Google Classroom, do the end of the war assignment, and finish that up, and there will be a Google form at the end to answer. All right, so hopefully that gives you some insight on the Cold War, and we'll talk to you soon.